This is Magic and How to Fix It. This episode, The Drunken Dragon. Read by Molly O'Donnell.
On any given night, the Drunken Dragon was filled with the sailors and adventurers drinking their week's earnings, and tonight was no exception. Xanthi tried not to visit the same bar too often, but this one in particular was a favourite of hers. The room was bathed in warm light that flickered softly. Shadows of patrons danced across the room as the bards played on the stage. Flutes and lutes played a familiar wedding feast song to the beat of the kettle drum, and the patrons sang along in good cheer. Under the cloak of magic, laughter and cheers, Xanthi weaved through the crowd until she spotted a perfect mark. A lanky elf with long, greasy hair slicked back on his head sat alone in the shadows. His pockets bowed open enough to reveal a glint of something shiny within. He slunk over, deciding on a stealthy approach. She dropped her gold pouch with a clink. He barely even glanced her way. Pleased, she bent down and placed 2 fingers in his gaping pocket. The object was bigger than she'd expected. She considered her options. This wouldn't slip out like a coin. She might have to tug, and he would surely notice that. But the haul from the day wasn't great. She could pull it out and make a run for it. She peeked at her exit route. Clear. She gripped the object and made a break for it. Just her luck. The song had ended, and the bards were taking requests. The crowd surged forward. Another popular song began, unknowingly closing up her exit route. She tried to squeeze, but she could not force her way in. She felt a tight grip on her arm and practically jumped out of her skin. The elf whose pocket she had plunged her hand into had caught her red-handed. Xanthi was average height for a dwarf. Next to the elf, she was tiny. He lifted her off the floor by her arm. Her hand still gripped the contents of the man's pocket. It was a small vial filled with a golden substance that flickered. He lifted her an inch off the ground. "Let me go," she said, each word punctuated by a kick. "What else have your sticky little fingers swiped today?" he said. He yanked her satchel with his tattooed hand, and she held on with her free hand. "I've not got nothing. Now let go," she spat. She mustered all her strength and planted a firm kick to his chest. He released her and stumbled back. Ever nimble, Xanthi landed on her feet, slightly crouched. She didn't hang around for him to regain balance. She took off towards the crowd and forced her way in. Afraid to look back, she shuffled through until she found a clear line left by a group travelling towards the bar. This would take her even further in, but the crowd was thick, and she was sure the elf was gaining on her. She placed the vial in her satchel as she moved following the path. She felt a spindly hand come down on her shoulder. She had to act quickly. She pinched an elven woman's butt as she passed. She spun, brows furrowed, catching eyes with the elf. "Did you seriously just grab my butt?"
"Who touched you?"
came a burly voice.
"Jackpot."
A green-skinned orc pulled the blonde elven woman into him by the waist. She looked at him with round doe eyes, then she pointed a finger right in the greasy elf's face. His face pleaded innocence, but he was already branded. The crowd formed a circle around them. They were of similar height, but the burly orc had to be twice the width of the greasy-haired elf. Xanthi gave the elf a smirk, then backed away into the crowd, taking advantage of the nosy drunkards shoving for a better look at the commotion. She stopped to catch her breath. She came against a wall of people barricading the bar. If she could just slip behind the bar and out the back before the commotion ends. She swayed, searching for a friendly face behind the bar, but people were shoulder to shoulder, all vying for attention themselves. The music stopped, and shouts erupted. She could barely make out what was going on in there. She would need to climb onto the table to take a better look. The fight was a clump of hands, legs, and hair. Above everyone towered the elf with short, spiky brown hair. He raised down punches indiscriminately on top of their heads. A man wearing wide-brimmed glasses clung to a girl by the waist. Her torso was engulfed by the clump of bodies. He pulled her out, and as she emerged, so too did long blonde hair held in a tight grip and wild hands thrashing at her face. A hand grasped Xanthi's ponytail and yanked her backwards, sending her tumbling off the table. She looked up, and a stocky man in scale mail stood over her. "You have got something of mine." He reached down to pull the bag off her. Xanthi's hands went clammy. "How many times do I have to say this? I've not got nothing of yours." She grabbed the strap and held it tight to her chest, leading to a game of tug-of-war. "Don't waste your breath. I saw you over there." His face was a cluster of scowl lines. His skin was leathery and worn. She kicked him where it hurt, and he crumpled, buying her a few seconds, but she was surrounded, and now it was her turn. She took a punch in the face from a woman she hardly saw coming. Nothing but a flash of flesh and then red, and then pain emanated from her eye socket through her skull. She fell to the floor into the fetal position, holding her bag to her chest. She wondered if this was even worth it. She was in well over her head. She often was. There was no weaseling out this time. Just a classic beating. She wasn't sure why, but the stomping let up. Then her head was pulled by her hair, and through blurry eyes she saw the elf with the spider tattoo on his hands crouched down in front of her. His face was now bruised and covered in scratches. "Hand it over," he said, extending his tattooed hand. "Fine," she said. She placed her hand in his and stood unsteadily. She was completely surrounded. She pulled out the vial and lifted her arm to throw it past them. "If you want it, you'll have to go get it." The group's eyes widened and their arms flew up. "Don't do something you'll regret," the stocky man said. She had no idea what she was holding, but she could tell the idea of breaking it struck fear into the hearts of these burly men. "I will. Let me leave, or I'll throw it." Out of breath, Xanthi scrambled out into the street, chaos in her wake. Sitting in a dark corner of another quiet bar was Hanfred. She was relieved to see him. Not because he was her friend, but because he'd happily take these goods off her hands. He laughed at the sight of her. "You look like you've seen the wrong end of a sailor." "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm glowing," Xanthi said. Xanthi took the seat next to him. "You got anything for me?" he asked. Her satchel glowed when she opened it. He sucked in a breath and then shoved her hands back down into the satchel. "Put that away," he said hurriedly. "What is it?" "You don't even know what you've got." He laughed again. She was getting a little bit tired of his humour at her expense. "I would get out of town if I were you. Look at your face. The people you took this from are going to want it back." "Just tell me what it is. Is it worth a lot?" "It's alchemist's fire. Explodes on impact. A nugget that size would set anything within a 10-meter radius alight. Not a lot of alchemists have the skill to make one even half the size. I'd say it's worth 120 gold pieces." She thought her heart might have stopped then. "How much for it?" she asked. "I'll give you, say, 50 gold pieces." That stingy old goat always gave her a bad deal. "Come on. Between my mum's healer's debt, rent and food, I'll be homeless soon." "It's hot. It'll put me in a difficult position." "I've not put you nowhere. Give me 60.
50.
55. He leant back in his seat, his arm clutching his drink. 50. 52, or our walk. He huffed, and he slid the gold across the table. She placed the coins into her pouch. She weighed it with her arm, feeling the heft of it in her palm, and a smile spread across her bruised face.